Right now, somewhere on this planet, the ground is moving in a way it has not moved in over 1,000 years, and almost nobody watching this knows it. Venezuela just buried thousands of its own citizens under collapsed concrete. Japan felt the earth shake for nearly 7 minutes and walked away with barely a scratch. And in California, scientists just discovered something buried in a mountain pass north of Los Angeles that they are calling a gate. Not a metaphor. A real geological structure that may decide whether the next major earthquake stays contained or doubles in size and tears through 13 million people at once. 3 earthquakes. 3 completely different outcomes. And one uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of it. If the ground itself does not decide who lives and who dies in an earthquake, then who does? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something most people never think about until it is too late, and by then, it is always too late. Let's start with the number that should stop you cold. 39. That is how many seconds passed between 2 earthquakes that hit the exact same stretch of Venezuela on the evening of June the 24th, 2026, not 2 separate disasters on 2 separate days. 2 ruptures, 39 seconds apart, striking the same region like a fist, and then, before anyone could even process what had happened, a second fist right behind it. The first quake registered at magnitude 7.2. The second, arriving as most people were only just realizing what was happening, came in even stronger at 7.5. Seismologists have a name for this rare and brutal phenomenon. They call it an earthquake doublet, 2 nearly identical ruptures happening almost back to back along neighboring sections of the same fault. It is uncommon. It is also when it happens beneath a city that was not built to survive 1 earthquake, let alone 2, close to the worst-case scenario geology can produce. The epicenters sat in northwestern Venezuela, roughly 100 miles west of the capital, Caracas, near a town called Umare. And here is the detail that turned 2 strong earthquakes into a mass casualty event. Depth. The first quake ruptured at a depth of around 20 kilometers. The second, the stronger of the 2, was far shallower, only about 10 kilometers down. When an earthquake happens that close to the surface, the rock between the rupture and the people standing above it barely has a chance to absorb any of the violence. Almost the entire force of the earthquake slams directly into whatever is built on top of it. And what was built on top of it, in large parts of Venezuela, was concrete and brick that had never been engineered to survive this kind of shaking in the first place. Venezuela has spent years in economic collapse. Maintenance on aging buildings had been deferred indefinitely. Enforcement of construction codes in the country's poorest and most densely packed neighborhoods had all but disappeared. So, when the ground lurched violently, twice, within less than a minute, entire streets of unreinforced structures did not bend. They came straight down. In the coastal state of La Guaira, sitting almost directly above the rupture, officials would later report that roughly 80% of buildings in the area had collapsed. 80%. Caracas itself experienced nearly a full minute of continuous shaking, sending millions of terrified residents running into the streets in the dark, not knowing whether the ground beneath them was about to open up entirely. In the first hours, official numbers were almost meaningless because the scale of the disaster outran the ability of anyone to measure it. Venezuela's government reported under 200 deaths on the first day. By the following day, that number had jumped past 500. Within a week, it had climbed past 2,000. As search and rescue teams slowly worked their way deeper into the wreckage over the following weeks, the number kept rising, and by early August, more than 6,000 confirmed deaths had been recorded, with tens of thousands still listed as missing. It is worth pausing on that pattern for a moment, because it tells you something important about disasters like this one. The first number you hear after an earthquake is almost never the real number. It is simply the number of bodies that had been found by the time someone picked up a phone to report it. The United States Geological Survey runs a rapid assessment tool called PAGER, designed to estimate the human toll of an earthquake within minutes of it happening, based purely on the physics of the rupture and the population living above it. Within hours of the Venezuela doublet, that system was already projecting the potential for the death toll to climb into the tens of thousands. That is not dramatization. That is a mathematical model built from decades of earthquake data. And in this case, tragically, the model was closer to reality than the early official statements coming out of Caracas. Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, addressed the nation as the scale of the disaster became undeniable, confirming that hundreds and then thousands of people had died and that rescue crews were still pulling survivors from the rubble days later. But there's a detail about Venezuela specific to this disaster that made the human cost even harder to measure than in most earthquakes. Venezuela has one of the most restricted media and internet environments in the world. In the days after the quake, journalists, aid organizations, and even ordinary families abroad struggled to get a clear picture of what was happening on the ground, because information itself was being filtered before it ever left the country. Families in Spain, in Florida, and Brazil were left posting photographs of missing relatives to social media, hoping someone, anyone, might recognize a face pulled from a collapsed building in a city they could not verify was even receiving help. Now, here is where this story needs to pivot. Because a magnitude 7.5 earthquake by itself does not explain what happened in Venezuela. To understand that, you have to look at a country on the opposite side of the planet that got hit by almost the exact same earthquake just months earlier and walked away almost completely unharmed. On April the 20th, 2026, a powerful earthquake struck off the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan, along the same offshore trench, responsible for some of the most devastating earthquakes in modern history. Different agencies measured it slightly differently in the first hours, with early readings ranging from 7.4 up toward 7.7, which is normal in the chaotic first minutes after any major quake, before more precise data comes in. Whatever the exact final number, this was an enormous earthquake. Shaking was felt from the northern island of Hokkaido down through central Japan, meaning tens of millions of people felt the ground move beneath them at the same moment. A tsunami warning went out almost immediately for the Tohoku coastline, the same stretch of coast that endured Japan's catastrophic 2011 earthquake and tsunami. Roughly 44,000 people in Hokkaido alone were ordered to evacuate to higher ground. Bullet trains automatically halted mid-journey. An 80-centimeter tsunami wave was recorded reaching the coast before the warning was eventually downgraded and lifted. And then came the part of the story that should genuinely shock you. Final toll. A handful of minor injuries. No deaths, no building collapses. Read that again slowly, because the contrast with Venezuela is the entire point of this video. A massive earthquake, a tsunami warning, tens of millions of people in the shaking zone, and almost nobody hurt. This was not a smaller earthquake than the one that devastated Venezuela. It was, by several measures, comparable or even larger. The difference was not the geology. The difference was every decision Japan had made about how to build, how to warn, and how to train its population decades before this earthquake ever happened. Japan's prime minister at the time, Sanae Takaichi, urged residents in the affected region to evacuate immediately to higher ground, a message broadcast within minutes across television, radio, and mobile phones nationwide. That kind of immediate, coordinated, nationwide alert did not happen by accident. Japan has operated an earthquake early warning system since 2007, one that detects the fast, low-damage seismic waves that arrive first and uses those precious extra seconds, sometimes only 10 or 15 seconds, to alert the public before the slower, destructive shaking arrives. 10 seconds sounds like nothing. It is enough time for a surgeon to stop operating, enough time for an elevator to stop at the nearest floor and open its doors, enough time for a bullet train to begin emergency braking before it ever reaches a bridge, enough time for a child, trained since elementary school through repeated drills, to drop under a desk without even having to think about it. Beyond the warning systems, Japan has spent decades enforcing some of the strictest seismic building codes on Earth, codes that are regularly revised as new research comes in. Buildings across the country are engineered to flex and sway rather than crack and collapse. Many structures sit on massive base isolation systems, essentially giant shock absorbers built directly into the foundation, allowing the ground beneath a building to shake violently while the structure itself barely moves. None of this is cheap. None of this happened quickly. It is the result of a national culture that decided, after repeated tragedy, that earthquake preparedness was not optional. And here is the detail that connects Japan's story directly to what is coming next in California. After the April earthquake, Japanese authorities issued something called a megaquake advisory, a formal statement that the short-term probability of an even larger earthquake striking the same region had temporarily risen. In this case, the weekly probability of another major quake rose to around 1%, compared to a normal background rate closer to 1/10 of 1%. That is roughly 10 times the normal level of risk. It was not a prediction. Japan's government was careful to say so. It was a statistical elevation, a signal to residents in over 180 towns across 7 prefectures to double-check their evacuation routes and know exactly where their nearest shelter was located. Not panic. Preparation treated as routine because in Japan, living with earthquake risk is not an emergency. It is simply Tuesday. So now you understand the two ends of the spectrum. A country where poverty and instability turned a severe earthquake into a mass casualty catastrophe, and a country where decades of investment turned an equally severe earthquake into a minor inconvenience. Which brings us to the third story, the one that should concern you most if you live anywhere near Southern California, because unlike Venezuela and Japan, this earthquake has not happened yet. In June of 2026, a team of scientists led by Dr. Liliane Burkhardt of the University of Bern in Switzerland, working alongside researchers from the University of Hawaii, the United States Geological Survey, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, published a study that immediately sent a ripple of concern through the earthquake science community. The research modeled a full 1,000 years of seismic history along two of Southern California's most dangerous fault systems, the San Andreas and the neighboring San Jacinto fault. Using radiocarbon dating of shifted soil layers, tree ring records stretching back centuries, and historical accounts of ground ruptures, the team built a physics-based simulation that reconstructed how stress has accumulated and released along these faults for an entire millennium. Their conclusion: stress along both fault systems is now reached, and in some locations surpassed, the highest levels recorded anywhere in that 1,000-year simulation. To understand why that sentence should concern you, you need to understand how a fault actually works. Two massive sections of the Earth's crust are constantly trying to slide past each other. Friction locks them together near the surface, even as the deeper rock keeps grinding forward. That locked section cannot move, so instead, it stores the energy, like a spring being slowly, silently compressed over years, decades, sometimes centuries. The longer that section stays locked without slipping, the more energy builds up inside it. And the more energy that builds up, the larger the earthquake when the lock finally breaks. The southern San Andreas fault last ruptured in a major event back in 1857, an earthquake estimated at magnitude 7.9, known today as the Fort Tejon earthquake. That was over 160 years ago. For more than a century and a half, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate have continued grinding past each other along this fault at a rate of roughly 5 centimeters every year without a major release. All of that unreleased motion has been quietly converting into stress, stored inside the rock, waiting. But Dr. Burkhardt's research uncovered something more specific and, frankly, more unsettling than simply confirming the stress was high. Roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, the San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault meet at a location called Cajon Pass. Under most conditions, this junction acts as a kind of a geological circuit breaker. An earthquake rupturing along one fault will typically stop when it reaches this junction, unable to jump across to the neighboring fault. The researchers began calling this junction an earthquake gate, because their modeling revealed that, under certain specific stress conditions, that gate does not hold. The rupture jumps across, and a single fault earthquake becomes something far larger, a joint rupture tearing through both fault systems simultaneously. According to Dr. Burkhardt, the stress configuration on both sides of Cajon Pass right now closely resembles the exact conditions that, according to the model, have historically preceded these cross-fault ruptures. In her own words, describing the current alignment of stress on both faults, that is the configuration we are approaching today. A joint rupture crossing Cajon Pass, she and her co-authors estimated, could produce an earthquake somewhere between magnitude 7.4 and 7.8. A rupture large enough to simultaneously threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley all at once, rather than a single corridor along one fault line. The researchers were careful, appropriately, to state clearly what this study does and does not tell us. It does not predict when an earthquake will happen. Nobody on Earth can currently do that with any reliability, and any claim otherwise should be treated with immediate suspicion. What the study does tell us is that the system is, in the researcher's own description, critically loaded, and that when it does eventually rupture, the physics now suggest a joint multi-fault event is a realistic possibility that emergency planners need to prepare for, not a remote worst-case scenario buried in an appendix somewhere. Consider what that would actually mean on the ground. The Los Angeles metropolitan area is home to more than 13 million people. Much of that population sits on soil that, depending on its composition, can amplify seismic shaking significantly, especially in areas built on river sediment or reclaimed land. Thousands of older so-called soft-story apartment buildings, constructed in the 1960s and 70s before modern seismic codes existed, are known to be especially vulnerable to exactly this kind of shaking. Gas lines, water mains, and electrical networks all cross these fault traces directly. A major rupture along both fault systems at once would risk widespread fires from ruptured gas lines, water failures, undermining firefighting efforts at the worst possible moment, and hospitals overwhelmed at the exact moment the region would need them most. California has not ignored this risk entirely. The state operates an earthquake early warning system called Shake Alert, developed by the United States Geological Survey, which can give residents anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds of warning before major shaking arrives, delivered through a dedicated app and integrated into public infrastructure. Building codes for new construction in the state are genuinely strong, but retrofitting the older, more vulnerable buildings that already exist has moved slowly. Funding for preparedness in lower-income communities remains inconsistent, and there remains a real gap between what scientists like Dr. Burkhardt now understand about this risk and what the general public living directly above these faults actually knows. Now here is where a lot of people start to wonder if something bigger is going on. Venezuela, Japan, and now California under record stress. Add in the fact that the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Nicaragua, We're all struck by their own earthquakes within roughly the same window of time, and the instinct to connect all of it into one giant pattern is completely understandable. So let's address that directly, because the honest scientific answer here is more nuanced than either a simple yes or a simple no. The planet is not overall more seismically active right now than it has been historically. Earth produces thousands of earthquakes every single day, the overwhelming majority too small to feel without instruments. Earthquakes of magnitude 6 or higher happen somewhere on the planet roughly 120 to 140 times per year, which works out to, on average, one somewhere in the world about every 3 days. Seeing several significant earthquakes cluster within the same week is statistically expected. It is not, by itself, evidence of some deeper anomaly. The tectonic systems responsible for Venezuela's disaster and Japan's earthquake are also geologically unrelated and thousands of kilometers apart. Venezuela sits along the boundary between the South American and Caribbean plates. Japan sits at the convergence of the Pacific and neighboring plates far out in the Northwest Pacific. These systems do not communicate with each other in any meaningful geological sense. One earthquake did not trigger the other. What ties nearly all of these events together, Japan, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and yes, indirectly California, is something called the Pacific Ring of Fire, a roughly 40,000 kilometer horseshoe of tectonic boundaries wrapping around the edges of the Pacific Ocean. This single region produces something in the neighborhood of 90% of the world's earthquakes and roughly 3/4 of its active volcanoes. It never stops being active. Monitor global seismic activity across almost any given week, and you will find multiple notable events happening somewhere along this ring, because that is simply what this stretch of the planet does, every single week, every single year. So what has actually changed is not the underlying geology. What has changed is us. The global population living directly along these fault lines has exploded over the past several decades. Tokyo, Jakarta, Manila, Los Angeles, Mexico City, Istanbul, Lima, all enormous, densely packed cities sitting directly within reach of major seismic events. The real question earthquake scientists lose sleep over is not whether these cities will eventually be struck. Geologically, that is close to a certainty. The real question is what condition the buildings, the infrastructure, and the emergency response systems will be in on the day it happens. And that brings us back to the number that should have stuck with you from the very beginning of this video. 7.5 in Venezuela, 7.4 in Japan. Almost the same earthquake, on paper, thousands dead in one country, almost nobody hurt in the other. If the size of an earthquake alone determined how many people survive it, that outcome would be impossible to explain. But it is not impossible, because the size of an earthquake was never the deciding factor. The deciding factor was every decision made in the years and decades before the ground ever started shaking. Let's talk for a moment about why the magnitude number itself is so easy to misunderstand, because this matters for everything we have just discussed. The scale scientists use to measure earthquakes is logarithmic, not a simple straight-line scale like a speedometer. That means each single whole number increase represents roughly a 10-fold increase in the amount of ground movement and roughly 31 times more energy released. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake does not release slightly more energy than a magnitude 6.5. It releases somewhere in the range of 30 times more. A magnitude 8 releases somewhere around 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. This is why scientists start to sound genuinely concerned once numbers climb past 7, and why the jump from 7 to 8 is treated as an entirely different category of danger, not simply one more step up a ladder. But magnitude alone still does not tell the whole story, and this is the detail most people miss entirely. Depth matters enormously. An earthquake rupturing 200 kilometers underground in a remote, unpopulated area releases the same magnitude of energy as one rupturing 10 kilometers beneath a crowded city, but the human consequences could not be more different. The deep earthquake loses much of its violence to the sheer volume of rock it has to travel through before reaching the surface. The shallow earthquake, like the one that struck Venezuela, delivers nearly all of that force directly into whatever happens to be built above it. Same number on the scale, completely different outcome on the ground. This is exactly why earthquake scientists never look at magnitude in isolation. They look at depth, at fault type, at how close the rupture is to population centers, at local soil conditions, and critically, at the quality of what has actually been built above the epicenter. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. There's a fourth city that earthquake scientists watch with a very specific kind of quiet dread, one we have not even mentioned yet, and its situation may be even more precarious than California's. Istanbul, Turkey, home to more than 16 million people, sits roughly 20 kilometers north of the North Anatolian Fault, one of the best-studied strike-slip faults on the planet. Across the 20th century, this fault produced a remarkable, almost mechanical sequence of major earthquakes that marched steadily westward across Turkey, one segment after another, each one rupturing roughly where scientists expected the accumulated stress from the previous rupture to have transferred. The most recent major event in that sequence, the 1999 Izmit earthquake, killed more than 17,000 people. The next segment in that westward chain, the section sitting directly beneath the Sea of Marmara, just south of Istanbul, has not ruptured since 1766. Over 250 years of accumulated unreleased stress. Researchers have estimated the probability of a magnitude 7.3 or higher earthquake striking beneath Istanbul within the next 30 years at somewhere close to 50%, essentially a coin flip, and roughly a third of that 30-year window has already passed. Istanbul shares some of the same vulnerabilities that turned Venezuela's disaster into a catastrophe. Older building stock, inconsistent enforcement of modern construction standards, dense informal settlements built without full seismic review. The city has been working to retrofit vulnerable structures, and Turkey has far more institutional capacity than Venezuela. But Istanbul is also not Tokyo. The gap between where the city currently stands and where it would need to be to survive its coming earthquake, the way Japan survived April's, is real, and it is not closing quickly. So here is where all four of these stories finally converge into a single, unavoidable conclusion. An earthquake is a geological event. The death toll that follows it is a human decision, made years, sometimes decades, before the ground ever moves. Venezuela shows what happens when poverty, political instability, and deferred maintenance meet a shallow, powerful rupture. Japan shows what happens when a society takes that same geological reality seriously, generation after generation, and builds accordingly. California is the open question happening in real time. Sitting on stress levels scientists have never recorded in 1,000 years of data, watched closely by researchers who are being very careful to say they cannot tell you when, only that the conditions are now genuinely in place. And Istanbul sits quietly in the background, its own 250-year clock still running, largely unnoticed by the rest of the world until the day it finally is not. None of this is meant to leave you anxious with nowhere to put that feeling. So let's end with something practical, because information without any action attached to it is just anxiety with extra steps. You almost certainly cannot retrofit your own home's foundation this weekend, but you can put together 72 hours of emergency supplies, water, food, a first aid kit, flashlights, any essential medications. You can locate your home's gas shutoff valve right now, today, before you need it in the dark. You can secure heavy furniture and water heaters to the wall so they do not become the thing that injures you when the shaking starts. You can agree on a communication plan with your family for the moment when mobile networks go down, because they will. You can learn the evacuation routes out of your own neighborhood before you ever need to use them under pressure. None of this takes more than an afternoon. In a major earthquake, these small, boring, unglamorous steps are consistently the difference between walking through the emergency and becoming a statistic inside it. If you live in Japan, you likely already know most of this, because it has been built into your daily life since childhood. If you live in Southern California, the research published this year is not background noise to scroll past. It is a direct message from scientists who spent 1,000 years of data trying to tell you something important. And if you have any connection to Venezuela right now, the priority remains simple, safety first, and connecting with legitimate relief organizations working on the ground. The Earth has been doing this for 4.5 billion years, long before a single human being ever stood on its surface, and it will keep doing this long after we are gone. We cannot stop an earthquake. We still cannot reliably predict the exact day one will strike. But Japan proved something this year that is worth holding on to. We can absolutely choose how prepared we are for the moment it finally does. Venezuela showed the world what happens when that choice gets made by circumstance instead of by design. California is still writing its answer, one stress reading at a time. And somewhere beneath Istanbul, a fault that has waited 250 years is not in any hurry at all. It has time. The only real question left is whether we do.